And migration is connected to that because about 25 men here began to migrate during World War II as braceros. Almost every family here has somebody who was a bracero in the 40s, the 50s, or the 60s. And some of those men, especially those who went in the 50s, who I've interviewed, came back and they bought looms. They essentially used some of that earnings to begin businesses. And some of those biggest businesses now, you know, their originators may not be around anymore. Their kids or grandkids are running the business, but they got, you know, essentially earned some capital. Okay, so the next step is obviously spinning. You probably have seen drop spindles in some of the images and historical work you've been doing. So this is where you really create the, you know, the tension in the yarn and the thickness in the yarn. And it takes a lot of skill, speaking from experience, to produce a very fine, even yarn, so that there's no, you know, what often happens is you might find little, you know, places where it's thicker, and that's not going to work in the loom. It's going to sort of stick in the process. So it's really sort of pulling and feeling the tension of the yarn and knowing exactly, you know, how much to pull at what time. And this is the first thing that kids learn too, carding and spinning. Yeah.
Do they make so many rugs because that's what the tourist wants?
Bueno, hay una pregunta, ¿hacen tantos tapetes porque eso es lo que quieren los turistas?
¿Vale?
Hay una pregunta, si ya hacen tantos tapetes porque eso es lo que quieren los turistas.
Pues es parte de nuestro trabajo.
Her answer was, it's part of our work. It's the work that we do.
Y pues lo hacemos y nosotros quisiéramos que a toda la gente le guste, pues para que compren.
We make them, and we hope that the people like what we make, and we hope that they buy them.
Porque de esto vivimos.
Because that's what we survive on. Yeah.
Before the bracero movement, were they already making these?
Okay, la pregunta es, antes de los braceros, o sea, yo decía que muchos de los negociantes grandes, algunos, como, no me acuerdo su nombre, Martínez, bueno, fueron braceros. Llevaron un pequeño dinero, pero invirtieron en telares y empezaron algunos de los primeros negocios con este dinero de migración. Entonces la pregunta fue, ¿existían estos tapetes antes de los años 40?
No.
Pero sí había tapetes.
Sí había tapetes, pero solamente, más bien era para uso personal y unos que otros servían.
Right. There were textiles, but they did not look like this. They were not produced for a tourist market. I mean, in the history of textile production, this is me talking in Teotitlan. As I mentioned on the bus, these are people who've been weaving for a really, really long time. You know, probably a couple thousand years, pre-Hispanically, you know, paying their taxes to Tenochtitlan, in part in textiles, lots. I mean, yards and yards and yards and yards of cotton, along with a lot of other stuff. The Spaniards come, they bring sheep, they bring the pedal loom. ¿Hay un telar? Aquí?
Sí, aquí hay uno.
Yeah, there's one behind over there that we can take a look at. And it's actually the Catholic Church, it's priests who actually introduce some of the forms of, you know, art and craft that you see in Mexico today, but usually in a hybrid sense. I mean, it's not like this was a totally new thing for people in Teotitlan. They had a sense of pattern, they had a sense of how a textile is put together. Just, you know, in a backstrap loom, you have your warp going from your waist. The warp is the thread that goes up and down, and the weft is what goes across, okay? And you use a shuttle. In a treadle loom, you thread the warp onto the loom, and then you use the pedals instead of, you know, hand motions to move back and forth. But in this very complex weaving, like this, you're changing, every time the color changes, you're changing bobbins. So if you're doing something like this, you're doing 2 of orange, 2 of brown, 2 of orange, 2 of brown. If you're doing, some of the more complicated designs, you're keeping track. It's really a mathematical process, and it's by memory. So it's a different knowledge system. It's really interesting for those of you who teach math or are interested in, sort of a combination of math, science, and art. This is it, because the science is in the dyeing and the plant knowledge in the wool. The math is in all the patterns and the precise calculation of color and the width of the design and how many you're going to do and then you're going to change. So it's really very complex. So this kind of knowledge exists long before the Spaniards arrive. And when the Spaniards come, people here are producing in natural colors of the wool. They're not dyeing it, and they're producing blankets and ponchos. And those blankets and ponchos are being traded down through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and down into Chiapas and fairly far away. And there's a well-documented circuit in the colonial period and really up to the 50s of mule transport. So people who were merchants all over Mexico and southern Mexico used mules to move their stuff up and down. So people from here might take off with a load of blankets and be going down to Juchitán and trading for dried shrimp and salt and going down to Tuxtla Gutierrez and bringing back, other kinds of products. They would bring back cacao, which it's too high here for cacao to be produced here. A lot of it comes from Tapachula or from lowlands. So the textile production that existed until really the 60s was a part of an integrated trade system of, goods. The Pan American Highway, which was also built during, I think it was in the 40s, during World War II, sort of completed. And there were hundreds of men in this community who worked on that road, connected it made a connection to Oaxaca, and other road developments brought tourists to Oaxaca for the first time really in the 50s and the 60s. So some of the first commercial production for tourists began to happen as a part of this process.
No sé si alguien quiere.
Who wants to try carding? All right. This is always a big photo op.
Do the ladies keep any kind of reference record of like